Hello and welcome back to the final video in our series on working with the Microsoft Graph API inside of Power Automate. This is our final video in our series where we've explored the Microsoft Graph API and how it can be used inside of the context of Power Automate. In this final video, we're going to be wrapping up with showing how we can now take users and add them to a specific Teams channel. So the reason why we need to use Microsoft Graph API for this is because there is not a built-in capability within the Teams connector to do this inside of Power Automate today. So there is a Teams connector, it just does not have the ability to add users to a specific channel, which is what we need to do for this example. Before we get going though, as a reminder, I always like to remind you, make sure you go ahead and subscribe if you haven't already to our channel to make sure you see any new videos that we have coming out. Also, if you haven't, hit the notification bell so you're notified whenever our new videos drop. And then if you like this video, hit the like button at the end of it. Let me know that you like to see more videos about Power Automate. That gives us some guidance on what kind of things you would like to see. All right, so let's do a little bit of catch up. Now, this is video 4 in a 4-part series. And so I want to catch you up a little bit briefly if you haven't watched the other ones. Now, I'm going to recommend, of course, you watch the other ones rather than me going through the entirety of each of those here. But what I'd like to do is just kind of briefly catch you up. And this might encourage you to go back and watch the other 3. In the flow that I'm sharing on my screen right now, this has been built over the course of several videos. What we're trying to accomplish here is have a new user get added into our tenant. And more specifically, we want to add in a guest user. And so the way we're managing this is through a Microsoft form. So someone will submit into an intake form that we have right here, where they'll enter in their email address, their first name and last name, and then by them entering in that information, it triggers our flow. That's what's happening in the very beginning here. And then we're taking the responses that we get from that flow execution using the get response details action. With the response details, we're taking a look at the email address that's provided to us, and we're using the Microsoft Graph API to search the email address to see if it is someone that is already part of our tenant, because if they're already part of our tenant, we don't need to go out of the way to add them again. If they are not part of our tenant, we are going to then do a condition, and our condition is checking to see basically is the ID column that's returned for their GUID that it would be associated with their email address or with their login. If it's null, then we know that they've never been added to our tenant before. If it's not null, then we know that they have been added and we don't need to add them a second time. So that's what we're doing in this condition. We're doing a check to see, are they in our tenant already or not? If they are, then they go to the right path, which does nothing. If they aren't, then they go down the left path, which adds them to our tenant using the Microsoft Graph API again. So we're using the Microsoft Graph API a few times. We're going to use it a couple more times here in this video as well. But we're using that to be able to not only check to see if a user is already in our tenant, but then we're returning back the capability to actually add them to the tenant when we find out they're not. So that's a brief catch-up of what we've done in the previous videos. What we're going to be accomplishing in this one is we are now going to add the user after they've been added to our tenant. We're now going to add them to a specific Teams channel. And then once they're added to that channel, we're then also going to add, I said channel, I meant team. We're going to add them to a specific team. And then once they're added to that team, we'll then also add them to a specific channel. And we're going to also add them to a private channel, just to show the fact that you can do that. You can add people to a private channel. All right, so how can we do this? Well, we actually learned a little bit in video number 2 about the Microsoft Graph Explorer. And the Graph Explorer, you learned, was a great way to be able to run some test queries and learn how to bring back some information. As part of that, we also were able to capture some ID columns that are behind the scenes that are stored inside of the Graph API that will allow us to capture a specific team and allow us to capture a specific channel. So go back and watch video number 2. My screen that I'm showing right now is actually leaving off exactly where I left off on video number 2. And here you can see up in our query, I have a team ID right here, and I have a channel ID right next to it. And those two ID values I am going to need in this video. That's part of why I showed you that part of the Graph Explorer, is because you are going to need those elements as we go into this next video where we're going to add someone to a specific channel. So to get started with this, what I recommend doing to kind of tidy up your work and make things nice and easy to navigate is I like to store this information in variables. So I'm going to copy my team ID right here, and I'm going to take that over to my flow. And up at the top of my flow, I'm going to add in a couple variables. I'm actually going to add in 3 variables. So I'm going to start by adding in a new step here, and I'm going to add in an action. And we're going to do a variable, so I'll search for the variable action. And we're going to set a variable, and I'm going to go ahead and name this variable. Oh, I did a set variable. I meant to do an initialize variable. Let's delete that. Try again. Let's go ahead and do an initialize variable here. There it is right here. So we have an initialize variable now, which means, first of all, we're going to have to name the variable. So I'm going to call this var teams ID. And then we're going to make this a string. I'm going to make that a team ID. And then I'm going to paste in the GUID that I captured from the Graph API. Again, watch video number 2 in this series that will show you how to get the ID that's associated with the team you want to assign someone to. All right, I'm also going to rename this action so that way we can understand the difference between each of these that we're going to be creating. So I'm going to call this initialize variable var underscore team ID. All right, then we're going to go ahead and add in another action. This is going to be another initialize variable. And this variable we're going to call, nope, I said increment variable that time. I did the wrong one again. Let's go ahead and try that again. Type in variable. And let's select the initialize variable, the correct one this time. And we'll call this one var team channel. Ooh, let's see if I can spell here. Var team, let's get rid of that extra Y there. There we go. Var team channel ID. This is also going to be a string, just like the previous one. And we're going to paste in the GUID that's associated with the team found right here. Now, again, in a previous video, we also walked through creating a new private team channel here. So you can see I have one called private test channel for YouTube. That's what we're doing right now. And so I'm using that same channel right here. In fact, it looks like I have a different one I have pulled up. I must have the one that's right here, the one above it. That's fine. We'll use that one. But I'm going to take the ID that's associated with that channel. I'm going to store it in a variable. So that way I know where to find it, and I can kind of reuse it multiple times inside of my flow here. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and rename that new action. There we go. And then I'm going to create one final variable. This final variable will make more sense later, but I want to go ahead and create it and use it as a placeholder. And what we're going to be doing in here is I'm going to create this third variable to store a little bit of JSON that we're going to be doing later. And it's going to help us to do this in a variable. If we don't do it in a variable, it'll cause some problems later. So I'm going to go ahead and initialize this variable. And I'll call this variable var underscore member body. We'll just call it member body. All right, and then we're going to go ahead and make this a string variable, and then I'm not going to put any default value into it. I'm going to leave it alone, but I will go ahead and name it. So I'm going to rename this and make sure I have the variable name in the name there. All right, so we created these 3 variables. The first two make sense. We are capturing the team ID and the channel ID, and we're going to use those to pass into the Graph API which team and which channel we want to add people to. The member body is going to make sense a little bit later, so we're going to circle back to that one. I wouldn't get too hung up on that one later yet. We're going to be making more sense of that as we move forward here. All right, so what I'd like to do is from my condition, after we add in our user, I then want to immediately add them to the proper team. So to do that, I'm going to add an action here. So I'm going to select add an action with inside of our yes path of our condition, and I'm going to use the Microsoft team action. And there is one here called add a member to a team. So after we add the user to Active Directory as a guest user, we immediately want to add them to a team. So I'm going to go ahead and select add a member to a team here. All right, then we're going to select which team it is that we want to add them to. So I can go ahead and select here my team called YouTube. That one right here is going to match what we saw in our teams tab right here. So you can see we have a team called YouTube. And so I'm going to go ahead and select that team. And then we have to choose the Azure Active Directory. That's what AAD stands for here. But the Azure Active Directory ID for the user to add to a team. So what is the user's ID value? Now, if the user already exists in our Active Directory, then we could actually capture their ID column from right here. If you look within inside of this action, we're actually having the Graph API specifically return back the ID. So we could actually pull their ID value from the Graph API call that we made earlier. However, whenever we go down this yes path, that means there is no user in here yet, so we can't pull that information from the HTTP request that we made earlier. We're going to actually have to pull it from this one after the user gets created. So immediately after the user is created, we then want to grab the ID column or the ID value that's associated with that user so we can use it within inside of the add a member to team. All right, so how do we do that? Well, we're going to go into this action right here, and we're going to use some dynamic content, and it looks like it's not bringing back the one we want to see here immediately, so we're going to hit the See More option. Let me go and take myself off screen for this. I'm going to go ahead and hit the See More option, and we're going to return back the body. Now, the body by itself is not going to be enough. In fact, it looks like I actually returned back the wrong body. The one that I want is going to be the one called HTTP add guest users, and I accidentally picked the wrong one. So I need to go find the one called HTTP add user, guest user, here it is, and we're gonna select the body from that action. All right, so with that selected, the field called body is actually not gonna be good enough. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna copy the body column, I'm even gonna cut it, and we're gonna bring it into the expression section because we wanna have a little bit more than just the body. We wanna call it a specific column we want returned back. And to do that, I'm gonna get rid of the curly braces that you see here as well as the @ sign, and we're gonna add on another column specifically within the JSON that we wanna return back. So I'm gonna put this in the description of the video for you, so rather than you watching me type, here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna parse the JSON and return back the invited user column from the JSON, and then we're gonna return back the ID column. So we're trying to return back the ID of the user column, and we're gonna use it inside the add a member to teams action here to make sure we pass in the ID value, the Azure Active Directory ID column properly. All right, I will put this in the description so you know how to pull this back, but just do note that it is referring to a specific action name that I have right here, so you'll need to modify it to whatever your action name is called. All right, so I'll hit OK. That's going to store that now with inside the add a member to team. And then the next thing that we're going to do is we are going to actually use the variable that we have here called member body. This member body variable, we initialized it earlier, we did nothing with it, but what we're going to do now is we're going to actually load that variable or set that variable, and we'll do that by selecting add an action here. And we're going to go ahead and type in variable, and we're going to say that we want to set that variable. That variable is called var member body right here. And then what we're going to do is I'm going to bring in from the Microsoft documentation around the add a member channel. So if you look up the add a member channel documentation, which again, I'll put this in the video description as well, we're going to actually refer back to the body section here that we would plug into our API call. This guy down here is actually telling us what kind of things we should be passing into our API calls. So we're going to reference this. We're going to use this documentation to help us know what to do as we're trying to bind information in and pass information into the Graph API. All right, so I'm going to shift that aside for now. And I have actually copied out some of this code for us to save us a little time, and I'm going to plug that in here. And this is what we're going to end up putting into the body of our next JSON request. The reason why we're doing this with inside of a variable is because we're trying to do a lot of dynamic content with inside of this flow. Sometimes when you have a lot of dynamic content, Power Automate can kind of struggle to read that downstream. And so if we can store it in a variable, it cooperates a little bit better for us. So what we want to do is we're going to use this little bit of code and we're going to pass in the user ID again, very similar to what we did right here. In fact, it's the exact same capability or the exact same expression we did here. We're going to copy this expression, copy it, don't cut it, and we're going to go bring that over here with inside of the single quotes that you see with inside of the member body variable I have, and I'm going to pass this in as an expression. All right. So again, the reason why we're doing this is because we have this dynamic content or this expression that we're embedding in here. And whenever you're working with inside of the body section of this HTTP request, it gets a little dicey whenever you're trying to write expressions in here. So I'm going to do this with inside of a variable instead. All right, so we set the variable. We're now going to use that variable inside of our next HTTP call. And so we're going to go down a little bit here and we're going to add an action. It's going to be an HTTP action. All right, you can see again, this is a premium connector. We talked about that in our first video. So I'm gonna go ahead and select the HTTP connector. The type of method we're gonna use is a post because we're trying to post a new user into this team, this channel. And so we're gonna go ahead and select that. And then what we wanna do for the URI is gonna be basically it's gonna have in it our team ID variable. So we're gonna have our team ID variable, and as well, we're also gonna have in it our channel that we're trying to load into. So I'm gonna copy and paste in the URI. The place I got this from is from that same documentation I had on my screen a few moments ago. So if I were to bring that over here one more time, the URI is what you see up top here. So I'm basically taking this section and I'm gonna pass in a team ID and a channel ID, and we're gonna use that with inside of the HTTP request here. All right, so you can see that same thing here, and I have a little blank where I can actually pass in the specific team that we wanna add people to, as well as the channel that we wanna add them to. Now remember, we stored that information as a variable at the top of our flow, so now I can simply go into the dynamic content. Let me take myself off the screen. And we can select here that the specific team that we want to pass into, as well as the channel that we want to pass into. That was all captured from our variables above. All right, great. Looking pretty good. So the other things we're going to do is we're going to specify the header. The header is the same thing we've done the last couple times. This is the application JSON. This is also in the documentation I had on my screen earlier. The rest of this is going to be very similar to what we have done in our previous actions, though. We're going to copy in all the authentication steps that you see right here. This is going to be copied down to our new action because we're going to use the same Active Directory OAuth. We're going to use the same tenant ID, the same audience, same client ID, same secret value. All of that is going to be copied down here on the bottom underneath the advanced section. So for our authentication, we're going to authenticate using Active Directory OAuth. For the tenant, we'll come up here and snag our tenant. Again, I don't mind that you see my tenant because this tenant will be disappeared by the time this video is done. I'm going to grab the graph API, the graph URL as our audience, the client ID. Again, we showed how to capture the client ID and the secret ID and the tenant ID. That was in video number 1, so you've seen that, hopefully. So I'm pasting all that down here from our previous action. And then the last thing I need to do is specify the body. Now the body is what we did in this variable up top right here. So we're gonna take what we did in that variable and embed it into this HTTP request. Now I should be a better boy here and go through and name these a little bit better. You can see this is just called set variable. I should call it set variable var member body, and then I should name this one as well. I think you kind of get the idea. It's always helpful to go through and rename these something a little bit better, so I can come through and name this one something like add member to channel, and I can come up to this one and I can rename this one and I can call it something like var member body. Okay. All right, so all we really have to do, because we stored the body information in a variable, is all we have to do for the body is we're just going to select our variable. So we have a variable right here called member body, and we're going to go ahead and drop that into the body here. Now, you could try and do this without doing it in a variable. I found that there were some roadblocks to that because of this dynamic content that we did right here. I was getting some warnings where I couldn't proceed until I stored all of this in a variable. As soon as I put it all in a variable, it worked like a charm. In theory, you should be able to copy this entire thing here and just paste it in the body. But when I did that, I started to get some warnings pop up for me. Here they are right here. My flow checker is giving me warnings. But if I were to switch this out, instead of having this stored like you see here right now, I could remove all of this and just use my variable, and I get no warnings from it. So this little warning should go away after a few moments. There it went. So storing it in a variable actually helps avoid some of those warning messages that are popping up that really aren't necessary, because once we get through this, it's going to parse all of that expression just fine. So in case you were curious, why did we put this in a variable? It was to get around some flow checker warnings that we were receiving here that would not allow us to even save our flow. All right, but this is looking good. We have this all set up now, so let's talk through what's happening here on the left-hand side. If a user does not exist in our Azure Active Directory, we then add them. We add them as a guest user. Once they're then added as a guest user, the next step is we add them to a team. Then we create a variable that has the necessary JSON for passing them into a channel, because the last thing we do is we actually add them to a specific channel. And the channel that we add them to is stored within our variables up on the top here. So we have our team ID and our channel ID. Those are the team and the channel that we are passing them into. And again, watch video number 2 to see how I captured the team ID and the team channel ID. All right. So this looks good, but this only really applies if the user does not exist in our Active Directory tenant already. But what if they do? What if they do already exist in our Active Directory tenant? What would I do in that scenario? Well, in that scenario, I would need to create another path on the right-hand side saying that, okay, if they if they do exist in our Active Directory tenant, then I just want to add them to the channel. I want to add them to the team, and I want to add them to the channel if they already exist. So I don't need to add them as a user, so I really don't need this step right here. That step can be removed, but I do need these 3 steps here because I want these 3 steps to be able to allow me to actually add them into the specific team as well as the specific channel. Now, in many cases, whenever you are working with inside of Power Automate, you may be able to copy some of these. So I can actually say, hey, I want to go ahead and copy this to my clipboard and then come over here and add it. Sometimes you'll have luck with that. Sometimes you won't. In this case, let's see, did it actually work for me? It looks like it did. It actually did allow me to copy this action from here and move it over here, so that's great. I would likely want to go ahead and rename this. Instead of calling it add a member to team 2, I would go ahead and rename this. And I can call this for existing users. All right. And then what I would like to do is inside of the add a member to a team existing users is I can go in and I can actually explore and I can change. And sometimes you might get this loading here for a while. If you get that, I would recommend actually saving and then closing and reopening. That's a little, it actually eventually did come back. But sometimes if you get, whenever you copy and paste something, I do see some little quirks with that. And I have to save, leave, and come back, and then it works. Now, one thing that's not quite right here is you'll notice that whenever we add a member to a team from our existing users, it's pulling this field from an action that's in the other path. No, I can't do that. I can't bring the user ID from here because the user ID is being created over there on the left path. So I need to get rid of the AAD ID over here, AAD ID, wow, it's a tongue twister there. But I'm going to take the user ID not from the left path, but I'm actually going to take it from my parse JSON query, an action that we have above. So I'm going to go scroll through my parse JSON information. We should see right here the ID column that we can plug in to the add to a team member. So remember, these are existing users. So if they're existing users, we're actually capturing their user ID right here. So we captured their user ID, and then we parse the JSON to be able to return back specific columns. These two actions kind of go together. So I'm going to use the ID column that is outputted from the parse JSON inside of here. Now, you're noticing that it stuffs it into a loop for me. The loop that it's putting this into is a little unnecessary for what we're doing because I really only have one ID that's being processed here at a time. So not super necessary here that it gets stuffed into a loop, but that's okay. It's only going to loop over at one time anyway, so I'm fine with it doing that. No harm, no foul from the loop happening here. All right, so now with inside the loop, though, what we're going to do is we're going to say, all right, we went ahead and we added the existing user to our team. Okay, so you can see that's right here. We're using the same team ID that we used before. I could go ahead and remove this and select it again if I wanted to. Let's actually undo that, and let's save this for a moment here. Oh, it really does not like whenever you do copying and pasting, it tends to throw fits here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and delete this whole thing, and I'm going to save and reopen. Doing those loops, copying and pasting, it really does cause some little problems here. I think now that I saved, I should be okay. Let's go ahead and go in, rather than copying and pasting, we're going to create this as if it were new. The copy and paste with inside of Power Automate, while it sounds like a great idea, doesn't always work as planned. Sometimes it's even faster just to go ahead and go in and create the action from new here. All right, so we're going to go ahead and use a new action here for add a member to a team. And it looks like it's still giving me fits here. So let me go ahead and, let's see, is it going to cooperate? There it goes. Okay, it's cooperating now. So we're going to use our YouTube team, and then we're going to use the AAD ID is going to come from the parse JSON one. All right, there we go. That's back to how we saw this earlier. I'm going to go ahead and save this again. Perfect. Just want to make sure everything's working as we go. I'm going to rename this again, and I'm going to name this to say this is for existing users. All right, cool. All right, so the next step here is we're going to use the same set variable. So I'm going to come up here, and I'm going to add a variable or a set variable action. All right, so we're going to set the variable. And the variable we're going to set is the same one we have on the left-hand side, but we're going to set it a little bit differently. I could copy and paste this here if I wanted to, but remember the invited user ID is not going to be right over here because what we're going to use instead of the invited user ID is we're going to use the ID column that came from our parse JSON query. Because remember, this is an existing user, so because they're an existing user, we don't need to, we're not going to use the ID that came from the add a guest user. All right, so we're going to go ahead and plug in here our ID column from our parse JSON query again. So that's looking good. That's all we had to do differently there. So there is a difference between the two. One is a new user, one is an existing user. And then the final step over here on the right-hand side really should be almost identical on the left as it is on the right. So I should just be able to copy this whole thing. Let's hope it works this time. The copy and pasting is a little finicky here with inside of Power Automate. But we're going to copy and paste this and see if I can add in this copied action here. All right, looks like it worked. Doesn't have a great name. I should name each of these a little bit better, but that's okay. So I'm going to go ahead and name these. We'll call this var member body, and we'll call it existing user. Oop, misspelled there. Let's try that again. All right. All right, good. So we've got that taken care of. Oh, it misspelled it again. That's fine. We'll leave it alone. I can rename this one as well, but I think you get the idea. So this is actually done. If I look inside of this action, I can make sure that everything came through and copied over properly. It looks like it copied exactly the way it was on the left-hand side. This is actually part of the benefit of using variables is I was able to copy and paste a previous action, and it will copy over here or paste over here exactly the way it was. And because I leveraged the variables, everything downstream is going to be just kind of picked up automatically for me. So big win for using variables here. All right, so I'm going to leave this alone. I think we are done. Let's talk through what we've done before we test this out. So big picture, somebody fills out the form. We then capture a team ID, channel ID inside of a variable, and we also create a member body variable, but we don't do anything with it. We take a look at their email address and we see if they're an existing user. If they are an existing user, then they get sent down the right path. If they're not an existing user, they get sent down the left path. The major difference between those two paths is the left path creates them as a user, as a guest user, and then adds them to the team and then adds them to the channel. The right path does not create them as a user. It simply adds them to the team and it adds them to the channel. There's no need to add them in as a new user because they already exist. So let's go ahead and test this out. I'm going to hit test, and I'll hit test. We're going to rerun from one of the previous runs I had here. So we'll go ahead and hit test here. Let's see what happens. All right, so it's going to run our flow. And I actually deleted this user from our previous example, so it should go down the left path. So you'll actually see here I have no guest users within my Active Directory, my Azure Active Directory. But if our flow completes, which it did on the left-hand side, it was able to add a user, add that user to the team, add that user to the channel. So what I'm hoping to do is if I were to refresh this screen right here, I will see a new guest user within my Azure Active Directory. So let's go ahead and take a peek at that. If I go ahead and hit refresh, there I am. That's my new guest user. And then I'm also expecting to see if I go inside of my team and I go right click on my team here or select the little 3-dot context menu, I can then select manage channel and I can see what users have been added. And I'm hoping to see, I'm not seeing my guest user here yet. Let's see. Maybe I need to refresh, huh? So let's see what happened. Let's go over to our flow. And it looks like it succeeded, so let's see what happened here. Devin Knight got added. I got added into the specific tenant. It looks like all of that was brought in properly here from what I can tell. So let's take a peek here. Let's see if it's just a little delayed with adding me in here. Let's see if I can refresh this. Manage channel. Maybe I did the wrong one. Let me check this one. Manage channel. Oh, no, it only has that one user. So what I'm hoping to see is that user get added. Now it could be a little delayed, and what I can always do is if I wanted to, I can go open up my teams.microsoft.com from my web browser, log in with that specific Outlook account, my personal account, and see from that personal account, do I have access into that specific team? So let's try it out. I'm gonna go ahead and go over, and I'm bringing over on my other screen here, I'm gonna sign in with my devinknight@outlook.com email address. All right, let's go ahead and try and log in again. I'm gonna log in with devinknight@outlook.com. Sign in. That's fine. And then what I'm hoping to see is I will have a new tenant, a new Teams tenant available to me in the top right. So let me pull this off screen for a moment because there may be some things in here I shouldn't show you that I have access to. So let's go ahead and wait and see if I can actually select the proper one. Ah, it is here. All right, here we go. Here's what I was expecting to see is down on the bottom, the thing that I haven't done yet that I'm missing out on is I have not accepted the invitation to this tenant. That's the piece I'm missing. I need to go to my email, and from within inside of my email, I need to accept access into this tenant because it looks like it worked. I have a new invitation here to this tenant. I need to accept that invite, and then upon accepting, I should be able to make my way in here just fine. So let me go ahead and grab that invitation. That's something we showed in our previous video, but because I reset everything here, I need to accept it one more time. And then I'll go ahead and select the Contoso team. And then we'll go ahead and hit accept here. So I did receive an email to add me to the tenant. That was the piece I was missing. I needed to click on that first. But now I should be able to get into my teams.microsoft.com using my devinknight@outlook.com. And look, you're joining Teams as a guest user, and I now see this private channel I have access to. So I can kind of come into this private channel, interact with it. I can see the lock here indicating that it is a private channel. Looks like it worked beautifully. Now the other piece here that we need to keep in mind is what if we have a user that already exists within inside of our tenant? So let's say I have my devinknight@outlook.com is already here. What if they're already here and I just need to add them to the team? So what would happen then? What would happen if I ran this a second time, for example? So if I ran this flow one more time, let's see what happens. The flow is going to run again, and we should see it go down the right path this time, right? It should go down our right path because the user already exists, so indeed it does go down the right path. It adds them to my team, which in this case they were already added, and then it also would add them into the specific channel. So the benefit there is if perhaps the user was already part of my tenant, but they weren't in the proper team, I can now set up here the ability to make it so that they can be added into the team even if they are an existing user. So that's the whole idea behind this. Kind of a lengthy video, but it's a complex problem that we solved here of how to add someone to a private channel even if they are a guest user. So really, really neat steps that we've done here. Hopefully you can follow along. Go back and watch the previous 3 videos if you haven't. That will help a lot with giving you some of the context of what we did in this video. Hope you liked this one. If you did, hit that like button. Let us know so we can do more videos like this one. Also, if you would like to make sure take that step to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you're notified whenever we have new videos like these come out, so you'll have access into those as soon as possible. So hope you enjoyed this one today. We ended up with a great looking solution, and I'll put a lot of good details in the description of this video so you can go back and look at all of the components of what we've done here. Thank you so much for joining. We'll see you in our next one. Thanks a lot.